Brown Book of the Hitler Terror by Lord Marley. Chapter 8. The Persecution of Jews. Part 1. One of the first acts of the new nationalist government of Thuringia was the dissolution of the Central Union of German citizens of Jewish faith within the territory of the Thuringian state. The following statement was issued by the government in explanation. Quote, "One of the chief objects of the Central Union is to fight anti-Semitism. As there is no anti-Semitism in Germany, the Central Union no longer has any justification for its existence. It is therefore dissolved as from today." End of quote. We are here dealing with questions of fact. Authentic reports and depositions relating to tortures, acts of brutality and outlawry directed against Jews living in Germany will show clearly enough where the boundary lies between atrocity stories and the appalling reality. It will become evident that although in some particular cases the so-called atrocity stories may have been inexact and exaggerated, yet they have also to some extent understated the actual facts of brutality. For example, there has been a report that a certain Herr Cohn had his hairs pulled out one by one. But it turned out that this Herr Cohn had been out of Germany for some time and had not suffered at all. But on the other hand, that a certain Herr Levy not only had his hair pulled out, but had one of his eyes put out and has been in a hospital for some weeks in danger of death. Mistakes in names and in places where incidents took place have come to light. But for every case reported which on investigation proved to be incorrect or exaggerated, there are 100 cases of torture, murder and robbery which have not come to light at all, for the reason that the people concerned have been threatened with death if they tell the truth about the crimes which are being committed every day in Hitler's Germany. The reports of actual incidents can stand by themselves without any reference to the problem of the Jewish question. Many attempts, written from various standpoints, have been made to present an analysis of the situation in Germany in regard to the Jews. Here we deal with this wider question very briefly. But it is essential to say something of the inseparable connection which exists between the Hitler movement and anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism as one of the foundations of National Socialism. It is an old practice of the ruling class to distract the attention of the people from their actual sufferings. It is not possible here to deal in a scientific way with the reasons why attacks on the Jews have for many centuries served as the basis for distracting the people in this way. Why throughout the Middle Ages the Jews were attacked as a religious community, and more recently for the most part as a race. The analysis made by Marx in the Jewish question has been followed by many subsequent writers, who have treated the question from a social standpoint. At the present time it is impossible to approach the Jewish question as a confused complex of race, nationality, people, and religion. It must be regarded as a social question containing racial, national, and religious elements. Anti-Semitism in modern Germany. Hitlerism is a characteristic form of the process of dissolution of the lower middle class in the age of industrial capitalism, and it has its parallel in the past. Anti-Semitism in modern Germany dates from the movement which developed under Adolf Stocker, a court chaplain, in the last quarter of last century. The basis of that movement was economic. There was a period of unrestricted speculation in the years when German industry was being built up after the victorious war of 1870–71, and this was followed by a severe economic crisis, which directly affected the lower middle class as well as the working class. Adolf Stocker found the new gospel of salvation in a campaign against the Jews. Ernst Ottwalt, in his brilliant study Germany Awake, writes of Stocker as follows, quote, "Without any regard to fundamental economic facts, Stocker ascribed to Jewish influence everything within the German Empire which seemed to him unhealthy and harmful. In the indebtedness of the peasant population of the provinces of East Prussia, which was an inevitable consequence of the increasing world production of grain, Stocker could see only the Jew who gave credit to the peasant, in order to drive him from hearth and home a short time afterwards, out of diabolical wickedness. He saw in the wretched position of the German industrial workers, not the greed of a type of capitalist which had been brought into being by the advance made in the means of production, but the existence of Jewish capitalists, and the Jews were responsible for everything." End of quote. Bismarck, the servant of the Jews. The anti-Semite propaganda achieved a certain success. The first revolutionary upheaval of the duped lower middle class was concentrated on the weakest point, that is to say, the Jewish minority. But when Adolf Stocker began to attack the rich and powerful Jews also, the solidarity of the possessing class was roused. Bismarck himself intervened, and the court chaplain who had become an agitator fell out of favor. It is amusing to find that the anti-Semitic movement of that period also attacked Bismarck, denouncing him as the servant of the Jews. A pamphlet published in 1878 contains the following: quote, "The credit for having raised the Jews and their associates into a ruling clique in Germany must be given to Prince Bismarck. The protection of the Jews is one of the blackest pages in Bismarck's glorious empire, with its consequences in the impoverishment of the working class, the demoralization of all sections of society, and the disgusting fusion of money with the aristocracy by birth. Prince Bismarck succumbed to the influence of the Jews. The society in which he moved was composed of Jews and the associates of Jews. They were always with him, and were his political advisers and the champions of civilization on whom he mainly relied." End of quote. This popular movement of the time inevitably found expression in excesses. The signal was given by the burning down of the synagogue in the little Pomeranian town of Neustetten. Then, too, the national indignation was roused by an act of incendiarism, and then, too, it was not the incendiaries who were brought to trial, but Jews, who were alleged to have burnt down their own temple out of vindictiveness. Pogroms followed, and when the popular movement had already begun to flag, when the economic crisis was over, this anti-Semitism took legal shape in the form of parties, and also found people who could supply the necessary ideology. Professor Eugen Düring, with his work on the Jewish question as a question of racial character, opened a new era of anti-Semitism, racial anti-Semitism. Since then, a great deal of ink has flowed in order to prove that the Jews are a race, and an outlandish, inferior, and criminal race at that. Apart from Chamberlain's ingenious assertions, this "science" has for the most part been content with coarse jests. Now, in Hitler's Germany, the science celebrates its triumph, and no doubt there are a good many people who will be able to earn their bread in this shameful way in the Third Empire. Anti-Semitic parties. Germany was the country in which anti-Semitism was first organized on a party basis. These parties were the German Social Party, the Anti-Semite People's Party, and later the German Reform Party. They had no other object than anti-Semitism, which was the sole aim and purpose of their existence. It was characteristic that their fortunes varied with the economic situation. But in any case, anti-Semitism remained parliamentary for nearly 3 decades. During this period it was a sociological rather than a social phenomenon. With the economic catastrophe of the post-war period, however, anti-Semite parliamentarism once more developed into a popular movement. The traditional anti-Semitic parties disappeared, but there were no fewer than 260 anti-Semitic organizations in post-war Germany. These were all united by the National Socialists. The National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany is indissolubly linked with anti-Semitism. In fact, it is quite unthinkable without it. Anti-Semitism was one of the foundations and the constant companion of National Socialism from triumph to triumph up to the seizure of power. Forms of anti-Semitic agitation. Recent German anti-Semitism, of which Hitler's victory is the fulfillment, has never worried itself overmuch to find scientific justification. It is one of the special characteristics of this movement that from the very beginning it has never proved anything, but always merely asserted. Its success depends on confusing and distracting people from the actual state of things. This anti-Semitism has always found expression in the most repulsive forms of incitement. During the Kapp Putsch early in 1920, the curious anti-Semitic symbol, the Hakenkreuz swastika, was first publicly exhibited on the steel helmets of the Erhardt Brigade. On that occasion, too, the Nazi songs were first publicly sung. Then also a real national man made speeches entirely composed of expressions such as Rathenau, the Jewish sow. On the streets the children were learning anti-Semitic songs. Now, in the Third Empire, they all know the glorious battle song whose refrain runs, "When Jewish blood spurts from under the knife, things will be twice as good as before." For 15 years, in tens of thousands of meetings and tens of thousands of articles in the press, the Jew has been presented by Hitler's party to the duped masses as the most utter abomination. The Jew is responsible for everything, for the war as well as the peace, for capitalism as well as the revolution, for poverty as well as wealth. The National Socialist agitation sees the Jew lurking everywhere and helping on the work of Judaism to reach its aim of world domination. And to Hitler and his followers this is equivalent to the destruction of the world. Here we can only give some examples of the absurdity and vileness of this anti-Semitism. Hitler on the Jews. We take these examples from the most official statement of National Socialism, Hitler's book My Fight, which is now circulating in many hundreds of thousands of copies. There we find, "The black-haired Jewish youth lies in wait for hours, satanic joy in his face, for the unsuspecting girl, whom he defiles with his blood and thereby robs from her own race. They were and are Jews who brought Negroes to the Rhine, always with the same aim and idea in their minds of destroying, through the bastardization that must inevitably result, the white race which they hate, of bringing it down from its high cultural and political level, and themselves getting the mastery over it." In culture the Jew defiles art, literature, and the theater, destroys natural sentiments, undermines all ideas of beauty and dignity, of nobility and goodness, and drags humanity down under the spell of his own base mode of life. If the Jews were alone on this world, they would smother themselves in dirt and filth just the same in their attempts to get advantages over each other and destroy each other, in so far as their complete lack of any sense of self-sacrifice, which finds expression in their cowardice, did not turn the fight into a farce. When the Jew wins political power, he casts aside the few wrappings which he still has. The democratic Jew of the people becomes the Jew of blood and tyranny. He tries in a few years to root out the national carriers of intelligence, and by robbing the peoples of their natural intellectual leadership, prepares them for their lot as slaves in permanent subjection." It must be borne in mind that these phrases occur in a book which is certainly representative and was written with the consciousness that it was representative. The extracts given in fact illustrate only the mildest and most restrained form of anti-Semitic agitation. A different and much clearer language is used in meetings and in articles in the press. For years the typical headlines in the National Socialist papers have been "At the udders of the Jewish sow," "The Jewish plague in the world," and so forth. And finally, it must not be forgotten that the main battle cry of the Hitler movement is "Perish Judah." In the Guide and Instructional Letter for Functionaries of the National Socialists, dated March 15, 1931, we find, "The natural hostility of the peasant against the Jews, and his hostility against the Freemason as a servant of the Jew, must be worked up to a frenzy." Day of Reckoning. It is necessary to recall all this in order to realize the ridiculous character of the dementias issued by the National Socialist members of the government in connection with the reports of the persecution of Jews, and the grotesque nature of the statement that the Jews would suffer no harm under Adolf Hitler's protecting rule. For 15 years the Jews have been spoken of as a world plague, as the most brutish of sub-men, and the adherents of the National Socialist movement have been given license to calumniate and persecute the Jews. Hatred of the Jews has been systematically nurtured. For 15 years a day of reckoning has been promised. Is it strange that this sowing of murder should bear fruit when the so-called national revolution developed? Every young National Socialist has been ceaselessly told that it is a moral act, and his highest duty as a national German, to extirpate the Jews. How is it possible to make these young National Socialists understand that now, when they are in power, they are to protect the Jews? So they are given a free hand, and very willingly too, for of all the things which they have been promised, the only thing they can be given is the satisfaction of their lust for murder. The government cannot give all National Socialist supporters bread and work, nor can it improve the economic situation, or redeem any of the promises it made, But so long as it allows the lower middle class to persecute and beat up the Jews, it can distract them from the tremendous imposture of which they too have been the victims. For this reason, the campaign against the Jews is given its head in Hitler's Germany. It would be a terrible mistake to think that the persecution of the Jews was only a transitory phenomenon of the period when Hitler took power. It is a political measure systematically carried out, and necessary for the tremendous deception of the people. Minister Goebbels, in a pamphlet called the Nazi Sozi, says that "the liberation of the German nation can only be carried out against the Jews. It is true that the Jew is also a man, but the flea is also an animal, but not a pleasant one. Our duty to ourselves and to our conscience requires us to make him harmless." Jews are watching you. To show that the anti-Semitic propaganda has not in any way stopped, but that it is being carried on in an organized way, making use of every available means, we quote only one of the publications which have appeared since Hitler took power. It is a book by Dr. Johann von Leers, with the title "Jews are Watching You." It is a somewhat random collection of photographs which are presented to the German people by way of a warning. Among some 60 photographs of Germans and people of other nationalities, there are pictures of Karl Liebknecht, who was a descendant of Martin Luther, of the Catholic leader Erzberger, of Willy Munzenberg, in whom there is not a drop of Jewish blood, of Grzinski, of the Catholic mayor of Cologne, Adenauer, of Erwin Piscator, son of a clergyman, who are all, on the National Socialist racial theory, Germans of pure race. But this is characteristic. In Hitler's Germany, no one takes the trouble to check up even the most simple facts which are supposed to be the basis of statements made. It is quite enough to make assertions and calumniations. Anyone who is inconvenient to the Hitler regime is a Jew, so far as this regime is concerned. That is all there is to it. The conception of responsibility is completely alien to these National Socialist writers. If anyone asks for any proof, the National Socialist storm troops are good enough to silence any inconvenient questioner. This is the reason why no one dares to challenge even the most nonsensical statements, and as no one contradicts them, the masses believe everything. This book, which we hope will get a very wide circulation, as it is really a revelation of the spirit of the new regime, contains also photographs of Rosa Luxemburg, Professor Einstein, Georg Bernhard, Leon Feuchtwanger, Theodor Wolff, Emil Ludwig, Max Reinhardt, Charlie Chaplin, Alfred Kerr, and the American banker Otto H. Kahn. No one who is not a National Socialist will find anything repulsive in these photographs. For the most part, they are splendid heads of clever and serious people of real intellectual standing. The only repulsive things about the photographs are the titles which Dr. von Leers has provided. Under Rosa Luxemburg is printed "Executed," Levine, executed, Erzberger, executed at last. The young Germans who shot him were released from persecution after the National Revolution of 1933. For Einstein there is the laconic remark, "Unhanged." This is a favorite observation of the compiler of the book. He uses it for everyone who has not yet been murdered. For Reinhardt, "his second-rate and soulless art," etc. Chaplin is described as a little sprawling Jew, as boring as he is repulsive. It is said of Toller, promptly locked up after Adolf Hitler's seizure of power. But not even this is true, as by that time Ernst Toller was already out of Germany. Erwin Piscator is called a Bolshevistic artistic Jew. The bankers Max Warburg and Dr. Karl Melchior are said to be extremely dangerous. Among these Jews there is a young man of the name of Schlesinger, who once in desperation carried out an attack on a train which cost many lives. Later on he was released on an amnesty. In the course of the trial it came out that Schlesinger was not a Jew but a German of pure race. Anti-Semitic propaganda made use of the name at the time, but subsequently had to drop its attacks when it was proved beyond question that this Schlesinger was "of pure race." But Dr. von Leers writes under his photograph, "Moved by greed and unconcealed race hatred, he caused the terrible railway accident at Leffert." But what does it matter? One lie more or less makes no difference to these people. Perish Judah. Herr Hanfstaengl, foreign press chief of the National Socialists, gave a semi-official interview on March 27, 1933, to the American representative of the semi-official Telegraph Union Press Service. In reply to the question, "Are the reports of alleged maltreatment of Jews true or false?" he said, "A few minutes ago, when I met the Chancellor at the Munich airport on his arrival from Berlin, he authorized me to tell you that these reports are one and all base lies." Hanfstaengl's answer to detailed questions about the persecution of Jews was, "The Berlin embassies of Sweden and Holland have investigated and have found that not a single Jew has been killed." 43 murdered. The list of Jews shot or beaten to death by the storm troops has been checked by us, and it shows a total of 43. These 43 are the cases in which the victims were murdered primarily because they were Jews, not because they were Marxists. These 43 authentic cases, which have been examined in every detail, represent only a small part, a fraction of the real number, which will undoubtedly come to light in the course of time, when it becomes possible to get more exact information on the actual incidents which have taken place in Hitler's Germany. These 43 names are selected from many hundreds of names. All cases which up to now it has been impossible to check satisfactorily are left out of account. We do not want to estimate or think, but to prove actual facts. A few detailed examples are taken from the mass of material before us. On the 18th of March 1933, a tragic doom claimed our dearly beloved and promising son, Sigebert Kindermann, baker's apprentice, who had just completed his 18th year, Moritz Kindermann, sign painter, and his wife, Franzekastrasse 5. Funeral, Sunday, March 26, 1933, 2 p.m., Weissensee. No visits of condolence by request." The Jewish apprentice Kindermann, whose tragic doom this inconspicuous notice announces, was attacked in 1932 by National Socialists because he was a member of the completely non-political Jewish sports society Bar Kokhba. In connection with this attack, a National Socialist was charged and convicted. In order to revenge this conviction, after Hitler's seizure of power, young Kindermann was dragged to the Nazi barracks in the Hedemannstrasse in Berlin and there literally beaten to death, his body being then thrown out into the street. A large Hakenkreuz was cut in his chest. An example from Kassel. Dr. O. M. of Kassel reports as follows. On Friday, March 17, 1933, bands of Nazis went all over the town of Kassel, dragging off members of the Jewish community whom for any reason they did not like, in order to bring them to trial. It should be noted that the victims were not persons who have been prominent in politics of any kind. The reason for their ill treatment was as a rule some petty spite on the part of the Nazi leaders. The following were particularly bad cases. Dr. Max Plaut, a lawyer, was dragged out of his office by a large gang of Nazis and taken away in a closed car which drove along the main street. As they drove along he was forced to shout "Heil Hitler" by blows with rubber batons, and each time he shouted the Nazis roared with glee. Plaut was taken to the Nazi headquarters, where a so-called court-martial was held and sentenced him for alleged professional shortcomings to 200 blows with rubber batons. He was then taken down to a cellar and strapped to a bench for the sentence to be carried out. He was then most terribly mishandled for almost 2 hours. After some time Plaut fainted. Water was then thrown over him until he revived, and he was given some alcohol by so-called "sisters." When he had come to himself, the mishandling was resumed. By the time the brutal punishment had been concluded, he had completely lost consciousness, and was left, covered with blood, lying in a corner. Plaut was then taken to his flat, where he died 10 days later. The doctors who were called to attend him, Dr. Scholl, a nerve specialist, and Professor Tonnesen, head doctor of the State Hospital, found the most terrible injuries, including serious damage to the internal organs, especially kidneys and lungs. His back and legs gradually turned completely black. Plaut had to be kept on his bed in a permanent state of narcosis, as when he came to consciousness he screamed so terribly that he was heard in the street. After 10 days of this he died. On another occasion, another lawyer, Herr Dahlberg, was most brutally treated in the same way as Plaut, and at the same place. It should be noted that some time previously he had had a conflict in court with a lawyer who is now in an official position. This dispute was brought up against him while he was being mishandled. There can be no doubt, therefore, that the tortures inflicted on Dalberg were due to direct instructions from this high Prussian official, who had previously been in command of the Kassel National Socialists. Dalberg was so badly injured that for some days the doctors were afraid that one leg would have to be amputated, but fortunately it was found possible to save it. Dalberg is still severely affected by the results of his ill treatment. Another particularly bad case was that of a young Jewish merchant, Mosbach, against whom, so far as I know, the only accusation was that he had had relations with a Christian girl, though these had been discontinued. Nazis broke into his flat, and in the presence of his mother beat him so brutally that his head and spine were terribly injured. A doctor was called, Dr. Stefan, who is politically on the extreme right, and he stated that even during the war he had never seen such an appalling sight. For a long time Mosbach hovered between life and death, but his life was eventually saved. On the same day, also at Nazi headquarters, two merchants, Freudenstein and Ball, were beaten and severely injured, both of them being dangerously ill for some time after. In both cases the ill treatment was an act of personal revenge on the part of certain Nazis, but I have no details. There was also a case of a banker named Plaut being severely handled, but his injuries were not so severe. He was 60 years of age. The crimes of the Nazis in Hesse were certainly not restricted to Kassel. It would not be an exaggeration to say that in every village in the province of Kassel where any Jews live there have been similar cases, some of them appalling. I know that in some villages all the male members of the Jewish community have left their homes and only returned, if they have returned at all, after a long interval." End of quote. Forced to sign a statement. Leo Krell, 25 years of age, living in the Skalitzerstrasse, Berlin, was attacked by a Nazi storm detachment and carried off to a Nazi barracks, where he was murdered. His body was then dropped in front of the Jewish cemetery. We mention this case because of what followed. His aged mother received a letter asking her to go and identify her son in the mortuary. It was difficult for her to identify the body, which was mutilated in every way. The Hakenkreuz had been carved in his face and all over his body and burnt into the flesh. All that was left of her son was a mass of bleeding pulp. Faced with this mutilated body, the mother was compelled to sign a statement that her son had died, quote, "after a long illness in hospital." End of quote. Such statements are always demanded from relatives in the case of people who have been beaten to death. If any of the relatives ever hint, even in private, at what actually happened, they can look forward to being brought before a court and sentenced to many months, if not years, of imprisonment for taking part in an atrocity campaign. As a rule, the storm detachment people concerned tell the relatives that they will suffer the same fate if they do not, quote, "keep their mouths shut." End of quote. A deep silence lies over Germany. The people who are suffering dare not even call for help. That would be treason. 43 mutilated corpses of Jews who had been beaten to death with rubber batons, steel rods, and leather whips have been recorded up to now. People whose only crime was that they were Jews. We do not know the total number of such corpses that have been secretly buried. Perhaps 500, perhaps 1,000, perhaps even more. The future will bring it to light. It is only after some years that it will be realized that all the reports of the brutalities carried out by Hitler's bandits, which have so far been published, fall far short of the appalling reality. 300 proved cases of barbarous cruelty. 43 mutilated corpses, identified and authenticated up to the present. And how many cases of people beaten almost to death, or injured for life? Up to now we have records of 301 cases of severe bodily injuries inflicted on Jews, cases in which we have been in a position to verify the place and date of the crime and the identity of the person injured. The actual number of Jews who have suffered ill usage must already be considerably over 10,000. Of the 300 cases which we have been able to verify, we give the following examples. In the middle of April, a number of papers reported that Rabbi Jonas Frankel, who was over 80, had been attacked and severely ill-treated by storm detachment men at his home in Berlin, Dragonerstrasse 37. The government issued a denial of this report. The rabbi's daughter, Ella Frankel, reports the following details. Quote, How My Father Was to Be Murdered by Ella Frankel. At about 7:30 on the evening of March 7th, 3 Storm Troop auxiliary policemen forced their way into our flat at Dragonerstrasse 37. 2 of them held me prisoner, with their revolvers pointed at my forehead and my breast. The third shot at my father, who was sitting at his desk. 2 bullets struck his head, and my father, streaming with blood, sank unconscious to the floor. One of the Nazis shouted, "That's fixed him." Then they broke open the desk and stole all the money in it. My dowry of $5,000 and 2,000 marks. Before leaving, they warned me against calling for help and smashed the electricity connection so that the flat was left in darkness. We later ascertained that these auxiliary police were members of the Dragonerstrasse storm troops. I lifted my father from where he was by the desk to the window, and for half an hour was calling for help. The street was cordoned off by Nazis and several squads of police. Anyone who attempted to leave his house was driven back with blows from rubber batons. Eventually some police officers came up, followed by officials of the Humane Society, with whom our neighbors had gotten into touch. They wanted to take my father to hospital, but I would not agree. 2 days later we were visited by an official from the Polish consulate. He found the flat still splashed with blood. For 2 weeks my father lay helpless. We were afraid every hour that he was going to die. On April 8th, some Nazis again came to the flat and demanded to see my father. They stated that if my father was willing to certify in writing that he had not been attacked by Nazis but by Jews, he would not be interfered with again. I told them that my father was too ill to write and that they must come back again in 2 days' time. They drew their revolvers and forced both of us to give our words of honor that we would give them the certificate 2 days later. As my father was determined in no case to give such a declaration, the only course left to us was to get away as quickly as possible. 2 friends wrapped him up in a rug and took him away in broad daylight to friends living in a distant part of the town. I was almost out of my mind with anxiety. We had previously taken away the 2 scrolls of the law. Footnote: a scroll of the law consists of 2 tables of stone, round which is wound a parchment on which the Pentateuch is inscribed. End of footnote. But we left everything else in the flat. I left the house in indoor clothes and without a hat, as our porter was a Nazi and he would immediately have denounced us. We took the train to Vienna. My father, whose head was covered with bandages, was represented as being very old and deaf. I said that I was traveling to Vienna and had promised to look after the old man on the way. Soon after the train left Berlin, a spy came and sat with us and put questions to me, but he left the compartment when we reached Dresden, as my answers had not made him suspicious. After Dresden, the examination of passengers began. German officials went from compartment to compartment asking, "Are you Jews?" I took up my position at the door of the compartment, in which there were only the 2 scrolls of the law besides my father. The officials had, however, already been given a report by the spy, and they greeted me politely and said, "Ah, you are the young lady traveling to Vienna and looking after the deaf old gentleman. We have this information already." So we succeeded in getting here and stopped at Reichenberg, as my father was quite unable to travel any further then. Later we came on to Prague. My father is still lying here ill. End of quote. We have given this case in detail as it is a very typical one, and we refer the reader to the accompanying photographs. A rabbi, 80 years of age, attacked and left for dead and his flat robbed. But the dementi machine has the effrontery to announce to the press of the world that there was no such person as this rabbi. This case is typical of 1,000 dementis of a regime which lies with an unscrupulous brutality equal to that with which it murders. Attacked in the synagogue. We want to state another case, the scene of which was a synagogue. Rabbi Berish was in the synagogue in Duisburg at the divine service when he was attacked and brutally handled. He was dragged out through the street, and after being wrapped in the black, red, gold flag, was made to run the gauntlet through a crowd of shouting men. Finally he was arrested, and the charge made against him was being responsible for public disorder in the street. The rabbi of Gelsenkirchen was driven out of the synagogue during the Sabbath service, and with a number of other Jews was taken through the streets to the Nazi barracks. There they were all forced to turn their faces to the wall and make genuflections. When the rabbi protested against this he was laid across a ladder and beaten with a stick. Later he was set free, and succeeded in escaping across the Dutch frontier. He arrived at Amsterdam so severely injured that he was unable to stand. Before the Nazis set him free they forced him to sign a declaration that his imprisonment had been due to a misunderstanding. Pogroms. The Frankfurter Zeitung of April 24, 1933, contains the following announcement. Quote, Wiesbaden, April 23rd. 2 assaults with fatal results occurred here on Saturday evening. The 2 victims were a merchant, Salomon Rosenstock, and a dairyman, Max Kassel. The police report on the murder of Max Kassel runs as follows. On Saturday at 23:30, cries for help were heard coming from a flat in number 43 Webergasse. At the same time, a number of shots rang out. A motor lorry driver who was passing along the street went and informed the police. The police ascertained that the cries for help had come from the flat of Max Kassel, a dairyman, 59 years of age. On entering, the officers found Kassel lying dead on the floor of one of the rooms. On examination, the body showed bullet wounds which had proved fatal. Further investigation showed that several persons, by breaking in a door panel, had forced their way into the flat and shot the man as he was running towards the window. The shots had been fired from an army revolver. The investigations did not produce any evidence showing that the motive of the crime was robbery, and the indications are that it was an act of revenge. End of quote. The official report of the second case states that on that Saturday at 21:45 the police were called to the flat of a merchant, R., 58 years old, living in Wilhelmstrasse 20. R. was lying on the ground only just breathing. The body showed no injuries. A doctor ordered the man to be taken to hospital, but he died on the way from heart failure. The housekeeper, who was still in the flat, stated that at 21:10 2 young men had rung at the door of the flat and asked for R. When he came to the door, the 2 men pushed their way into the flat, and one of them pointed a revolver at R. R. fled into another room and fell to the ground. The 2 attackers then left the flat without giving any further explanation. According to the woman's description, they were 2 lads of between 20 and 23 years of age. We mention these cases because they seem to us typical of the actual pogrom which is being carried out. End of Chapter 8, Part 1. Chapter 8 of Brown Book of the Hitler Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Brown Book of the Hitler Terror by Lord Marley. Chapter 8, Part 2. Living Targets. These are a few of the cases which authorities have themselves made public, but this does not mean that thousands of similar acts of brutality have not taken place, although nothing is said of them. One day, in the middle of a Berlin street, the son of an attendant at a synagogue was attacked by a Nazi troop in the presence of his father. The lad was held by the Nazis, and one of them fired his revolver twice through the lad's right calf and twice through his left calf. The lad has now been in hospital for 3 months, and it is probable that he will be lame for life. A case from the provinces. The following statement, which we have received, has been checked up by us in detail. It is typical of hundreds of similar reports which are in the possession of editors outside Germany, and also in the hands of many private individuals. Quote, in the little town of Niederstetten in Württemberg State, a small Jewish community has lived for centuries. Its members are for the most part merchants, who, as might be expected, insofar as they take any interest in politics, belong to the parties of the right rather than to the socialists or communists. Friendly relations existed until quite recently between the Christian and the Jewish sections of the population. A week before Easter, a Nazi detachment arrived in the town early one morning and occupied the town hall, also taking control of the police. Then the houses of the Jews were searched for communist documents, naturally without any result. In spite of this, 10 Jews, all respected citizens, were taken to the town hall and there one by one taken to a room. Each of them was then gagged, thrown across a chair, and beaten with steel rods until he was practically unconscious. Then the victims, who could hardly stand, were taken to the council chamber and made to stand up against the wall, the Wailing Wall, as the Nazis called it. After they had been forced to give the fascist salute, they were allowed to leave the town hall. Most of them, however, were so weak after the ill treatment they had received that they had to be carried home by their relatives. All the victims were ill for some weeks, and one of them has lost his speech. It should be mentioned that the non-Jewish population of the town, most of whom had voted Nationalist in the election of March 5th, were very indignant at what had taken place. An old peasant said, "Hitler certainly would not have wanted this to be done." The old man apparently did not have a wireless, or else he would have known that these German men have only carried out what the leading people in Germany have broadcast as their aim in thundering speeches every evening. End of quote. The following appeal, issued by the Action Committee for Fighting Judah in Neustadt, was published in the local paper dated May 18, 1933. Quote, "Our aim is to liberate Neustadt from Jews and servants of the Jews. We must lay this down once again in plain language in case the people who are affected by it have not yet understood it. If anyone still thinks that he can defend the Jews, in our eyes he is a scoundrel with whom we shall deal in the same way as we deal with the Jews." End of quote. In the Nazi barracks. K.W. of Berlin reports as follows on his experience in a Nazi barracks. Quote, "A 26-year-old Jew was brought in with me. He told me later that he had been arrested on his motorcycle, although he had never paid any attention to politics and has never voted. First, his hair was cut off with nail scissors, and then the auxiliary police had a dispute as to who was to beat him. The auxiliary policeman who had brought him in said, 'I need not have brought the Jew in at all if I'm not going to be allowed to beat him.' The others said, 'You're drunk, go and sleep it off.' Most of the auxiliary police smelt strongly of alcohol. After that, the Jew was beaten up like the others, with cowhide whips, steel rods, and rubber batons. Then a dagger was placed against his chest, and he was told, 'Now you are going to be stabbed to death.' He was actually only scratched, and then he was told that he would be stabbed to death early the following morning. At 5:45 I was brought to trial. As they could produce nothing against me, I was taken to the sleeping hall, where about 40 men were lying. I myself was only given a few kicks and blows with rubber batons. There was also what they called a murder cell. The 3 men who were in this cell had been beaten black from head to foot. At 7 o'clock in the morning the Nazi officer in charge arrived, and we were given breakfast, coffee, and dry bread. Then we were drilled in the courtyard, after we had been forced to say, 'Hail to our Chancellor, Adolf Hitler.' While we were being drilled we had to sing Deutschland über alles and other similar songs. Then we were asked whether we would defend the Fatherland if there was a war against Poland. We replied that we would. After that we were asked what we would do if we were set free, and whether we would join the Nazis, and to this we also replied in the affirmative." End of quote. Polish protests. We cite the following, which is one of many official announcements and protests made by foreign countries. Quote, "Berlin, March 30th. The Polish ambassador in Berlin has lodged a protest with the German government against the persecution of Polish Israelites by Hitler's bands. The ambassador mentioned, among other cases, the following, which had occurred in Berlin. On March 4th, Herr Israel Weiss was taken from his flat and dragged off to a garage, where he was so brutally treated that he lost consciousness. After that he was taken to the police station, where he was kept until March 6th. While he was being assaulted, Hitler's followers took from him his passport and his ring, and he never recovered those. On March 6th, Herr A.L. Mittelmann was attacked and taken into a restaurant, where he was very severely injured. As a result of his treatment he is quite unable to work. In Chemnitz and Plauen, Hitler's followers have perpetrated terrible brutalities against the Jews. All the Polish Israelites who were arrested in Chemnitz were taken under guard through the town, being made to wash out all the inscriptions which had been written on the walls during the last election. A Polish citizen, Adalbert Daphner, was given 50 lashes with a riding whip, being forced after every blow to say thank you. Terrible cruelties were carried out against a number of Israelites in the prison at Plauen." End of quote. United States complaints. A message from Berlin dated March 9th states that the American ambassador has lodged a protest against the ill treatment of American citizens. He cites a number of cases which have occurred in Berlin alone in the course of a few days. Quote, "In Berlin many Jews, including some of American nationality, have been brutally treated. For example, an American citizen, Herr Max Schussler, who is the owner of a house and had secured the eviction from his house of a Nazi tenant, was visited by Nazis one night. In order to gain entry to his flat they represented themselves to be police. Then they demanded that Herr Schussler should sign a declaration allowing the return of his National Socialist tenant." End of quote. Official statement from Czechoslovakia. The official press bureau announces under date of April 2nd, quote, In the hospital at Warnsdorf, 4 refugees from Germany who have been brutally treated are now lying. Last night at 1 o'clock they were taken from a place in Saxony, which is now a concentration camp, to another village not far from Warnsdorf, being accompanied by 12 Nazis. They were 4 Jews, one of whom is an Austrian citizen, 2 being Poles, and the 4th having no nationality. 100 yards from the frontier near Warnsdorf, the 4 men were taken out of the lorry and beaten up until they were covered with blood, and when they ran towards the frontier of Czechoslovakia, shots were fired after them. All 4 are seriously injured. One of them, in addition to other wounds, has a serious fracture of the skull and is unconscious. It must be noted that 2 of them had been settled in Leipzig for 25 years, where they were in business, and the other 2 had been 12 years in Dresden. It is announced from Germany that the refugees had refused to leave Germany, and had conducted themselves in an offensive manner to the guards who were accompanying them." End of quote. At the frontier. The following message comes from Prague. Quote, "The Berlin-Athens Express, which every day brings several hundred people to Prague, arrived there an hour late on April 1st, and with only 3 passengers. The passengers made depositions which they signed before a notary regarding what had happened in Dresden. At the station in Dresden, a cordon of Nazis had been drawn up on both sides of the train, and another detachment came through the compartments giving the order, 'Jews out of the train.' All Jewish passengers, including foreigners, were forced to leave the train. After this, the passports of the other passengers on the train were examined, and they were also forced to get out. They were forced to line up on the platform, and then they were ordered to march. The column of passengers, guarded by Nazis, went off towards the exit from the station. After this, nothing more has been heard of them. They included many women and children." End of quote. Another report runs as follows. Quote, "The National Socialists even come onto Czechoslovakian territory and promise a reward for any refugees who can be brought onto German territory under any pretext. The reward promised for an ordinary refugee is 100 crowns. For a Jewish refugee, however, the amount is 200 crowns. These facts have been certified by the Czechoslovakian authorities." End of quote. The following laconic announcement from Warsaw throws further light on the position of refugees. Quote, "Warsaw, March 15th. 48 Jewish families from Germany, consisting in all of 150 persons, have crossed the frontier of East Prussia and taken refuge in Poland. There were terrible scenes at the frontier, the refugees being horribly ill-treated by the German frontier guards. They were beaten and kicked, and everything they had with them was taken from them by the guards." End of quote. The Chief Rabbi of France issues a statement. In connection with the denials issued by the German authorities, the Chief Rabbi of France has issued the following statement in connection with the anti-Semitic excesses in Germany. Quote, "I am unfortunately compelled to say that the statements regarding atrocities are absolutely correct. We have evidence that cannot be disputed and also photographic documents. Do not think that we believe what we are told by refugees without further examination. We have ways of checking up on their statements. We are in possession of documents which have come to us from an absolutely reliable source, which I am not able to name. I can, however, say that some of these documents have an official character and have been prepared by foreign governments. The incidents in question are not cases of simple abuse, but cruel persecutions which have created victims and martyrs. If we are compelled to publish these documents, we shall do so. The conscience of the world," the Chief Rabbi continues, "is deeply troubled and is horrified at the revival of barbarism which the anti-Semitism of the Nazis represents. In the name of humanity and civilization, the whole world protests with us. It fears that the restoration of world peace will be endangered through these new attacks of brutal force against right." End of quote. The correspondent of the English Manchester Guardian has made an extremely detailed and objective report published April 8, 1933, which is certainly not colored either by love or by hatred of National Socialism, but only by a human horror of brutality. Quote, "The samples of outrages committed by brownshirts since the elections make it more evident than ever that the terror has been much worse than was at first believed. The British, French, and American press, so far from exaggerating it, as the German press complains, has understated the truth, although this is natural enough, seeing that only a small fraction of the truth is accessible. The terror seems to have been worst of all, worse even than in Berlin, in Kassel, in Silesia, where Heines, who was imprisoned on a charge of manslaughter and released by an amnesty, is in charge of the brownshirts, in Worms, and in many villages. A precise account of what has happened in the villages of Oberhessen alone during the last 4 weeks would make a terrible story, but it is impossible to establish more than a few cases, enquiry being made difficult by the general fear not only of reprisals but also of imprisonment. A few days ago a man was sentenced to a year's imprisonment for spreading the false rumor that a Jew had been hanged by the brown shirts. The rumor, as a matter of fact, was true. The Jew, a certain Mr. was beaten by brown shirts and hanged by his feet so that his head was suspended off the ground. When the brown shirts had finished with him, he was dead. Any German who dare say a true word about the terror in his own country runs the risk of a fearful beating, or long imprisonment, or even death, and no one can reasonably be expected to run such a risk. But as one of the victims of the terror said to your correspondent today, it is impossible to remain silent even under threats. There is no reason why opinion in England and the United States should be hoodwinked, and it is necessary to point out that letters or statements by German Jewish or Republican organizations or societies saying that the terror has been exaggerated are products of fear and intimidation, and are therefore altogether unworthy of credence. Thousands upon thousands of Germans have only one wish, to get out of the country. But the frontiers are being closed by the new passport regulations, and escape is impossible except at great risk. Thus all Germany is being converted into a huge prison." End of quote. Einstein's appeal. We will end this section with the appeal issued by Professor Einstein after he had been driven out of Germany. Professor Einstein arrived at Havre on March 27th on the steamer Belgenland. He was met by a delegation of the International League Against Anti-Semitism and gave the following statement written by his own hand. Quote, "The actual facts of brutal force and oppression against every free-minded person and against the Jews, the facts of what has taken place and is still taking place in Germany, have fortunately aroused the conscience of every country which remains true to the ideals of humanity and political freedom. All friends of our civilization, which is so seriously menaced, should concentrate all their efforts in order to rid the world of this psychological disease." End of quote. The boycott. A defensive movement. From its early days, National Socialism has made use of the method of representing itself as attacked, persecuted, and menaced. The political terror which has been organized by Hitler has always worked hand in hand with organized lies. The boycott against Jewish business concerns, and the special acts against German Jews, of which we will speak later, give the best examples of the combined use of these methods. The National Socialists might have said, "It is in accord with our program and with the demands which we have been making for many years that the Jews in Germany should be completely wiped out." But what did the Nazis actually do by way of justifying their boycott of Jewish shops? They cried out, "We have been attacked. The Jews are trying to destroy us. What we are doing is in self-defense." This organized boycott was therefore called a defensive movement. The boycott manifesto, which was posted up everywhere, runs as follows. Quote, "Men and women of the German nation, the people who are guilty of this crime, this despicable atrocity campaign, are the Jews in Germany. They have called to their fellows abroad to fight against the German people. It is they who have issued lying statements and abuse. For that reason the leaders of the German movement of liberation have decided, by way of defense against this criminal campaign, to impose a boycott on all Jewish businesses, shops, etc., as from 10 o'clock in the morning of April 1st, 1933. We call on you, German men and women, to make this boycott effective. Do not buy from Jewish businesses and shops. Do not go to Jewish lawyers. Have nothing to do with Jewish doctors. Show the Jews that they cannot go unpunished if they humiliate and dishonor Germany. Anyone who opposes this manifesto thereby proves that he is on the side of the enemies of Germany." End of quote. On March 28th, the national leaders of the National Socialist Party published a manifesto to all party organizations in which the German Jews are accused of having started the atrocity campaign against the national government of Germany. The 11 points of the program. On the same day, the famous 11 points for carrying through the boycott were published. We give them verbatim below. 1. In each local group and section of the National Socialist Party, action committees must be formed at once for the practical and systematic carrying out of the boycott of Jewish shops, Jewish goods, Jewish doctors, and Jewish lawyers. The action committees are responsible for seeing that the boycott does not harm any innocent person, but that it hits all the harder all those who are guilty. 2. The action committees are responsible for protecting all foreigners without regard to their religion or race. The boycott is a purely defensive measure, and it is exclusively directed against German Jews. 3. The action committees must immediately popularize the boycott by propaganda and explanatory statements. The principle of the boycott is that no German should buy from any Jew or be served by any Jew or his assistants. The boycott must be general. It must be carried out by the whole people and must hit Judah in its most sensitive spot. 4. In cases of doubt, the boycott of businesses must be postponed pending a decision from the Central Committee in Munich. 5. The action committees must closely watch the newspapers from the standpoint of how far they take part in the Enlightenment campaign of the German people against the atrocity campaign of the Jews. If the newspapers do not do this, or only do it to a limited extent, steps must be taken to see that they are immediately prevented from reaching any house in which Germans live. No German man and no German business must give them advertisements. They must be given to understand that they incur only public contempt, and that they are written for people of Jewish race but not for Germans. 6. The action committees must carry into the factories their propaganda of enlightenment as to the consequences to German labor of the Jewish atrocity campaign, and they must explain to the workers that the national boycott was necessary as a protective measure on behalf of German labor. 7. The action committees must carry their activities into the smallest villages in order to strike particularly at the Jewish traders in the countryside. 8. The boycott must not be introduced gradually, but at a single blow. All preparatory measures must therefore be taken immediately with this in view. Instructions must be given to the storm troops to post pickets to warn the population against entering Jewish shops from the moment when the boycott begins. This will be April 1st punctually at 10 o'clock in the morning. It will be carried on until instructions are received from the party leadership. 9. The action committees must immediately popularize at thousands of mass meetings, which must reach even the smallest village, the demand that Jews shall only be admitted to every profession in proportion to the number of Jews in the community. In order to make this action more effective, the demand should at first be restricted to 3 sections. A. Students in the intermediate schools and universities. B. The medical profession. C. The legal profession. 10. The action committees are furthermore charged to see that every German who has any connection whatever with people in other countries should make use of this, in letters, telegrams, and telephonic communications, to spread the truth that peace and order reign in Germany, that the German people has no more ardent wish than to continue its work in peace and to live in peace with the rest of the world, and that its fight against the Jewish atrocity campaign is purely defensive. 11. The action committees are responsible for seeing that the whole fight is carried out absolutely peacefully and with the strictest discipline. Henceforth no Jew must have even a hair of his head harmed. We must finish with this atrocity campaign purely through the effectiveness of the measures outlined above. This manifesto was accompanied by a long-winded explanation, each word of which was evidence of a bad conscience. The explanation concluded with the words, "National Socialists, on Saturday at 10 o'clock the Jews will know who it is that they are fighting." The lords of the Third Empire appointed to take charge of this defensive action a man named Julius Streicher, the editor of a newspaper called Der Stürmer. The outside world will not know what sort of paper this is, although from time to time its circulation runs into hundreds of thousands. For his services in editing this, Herr Streicher has been appointed commissioner in charge of the boycott movement. Herr Streicher had hardly taken up his post when he gave an interview to the press at a conference of national journalists on March 30th. In the course of this interview he said, quote, "I shall not hesitate to prohibit by force the holding of divine service by the German Jews, or to prevent them from gaining entry to the synagogues by the use of armed storm troops. The stone has now begun to roll. Whether the atrocity propaganda ceases or not makes no difference. This foreign propaganda against Hitler has given us the opportunity which we welcome, and the action will be carried through. It would be a complete illusion to imagine that the Nazis will allow themselves to be held back." End of quote. He, Streicher, was completely satisfied with the way things had developed. His only care in the past week had been to see that the war of destruction against the Jews did not weaken. Quote, "Had this happened, this is my firm conviction, the national revolution would have collapsed owing to its own weakness. This danger has now finally been averted, and the German people can trust in me to carry out the whole of the necessary work in connection with the Jews." Preparations for the boycott. Incitements to Jew baiting were systematically developed during the last few days before the boycott. An example of this was the speech given by the newly appointed chief of police in Frankfurt, reported in the Frankfurter Volksblatt of March 30th. Quote, "No Nazi will have anything to do with a Jew, because he knows that the Jew is of inferior race, and I am no longer going to permit animals born on German soil to be killed by the sadistic Asiatic methods of slaughter used by the Jews. If the Jew cannot eat our meat, then let him eat potatoes and turnips as you did in the hungry winters of the war. Germany is awake. You Jews, you have no need to tremble. We shall remain legal, so legal that perhaps legality will be uncomfortable for you, and then you can go to Palestine and fleece each other." The instructions from the Nazi leaders issued in a steady stream. Action committees were set up everywhere, and they were given the task of ascertaining which shops, stores, lawyers' offices, etc., were in the hands of Jews. The Central Committee for the Boycott of Jewish Concerns laid down the following principles for action. Quote, "The action committees must hand over to the storm troops the list of shops which have been ascertained to be Jewish, in order that these may be picketed from 10 o'clock on the morning of Saturday, April 1st, 1933. The pickets are charged with informing the public that the shops at which they are posted are Jewish. They are forbidden to take any physical measures of restraint. They are also forbidden to close the shop. In order to make it clear which shops are Jewish, posters or placards with yellow spots on a black ground must be posted at the entrance doors. The Jewish shops which are boycotted must not dismiss their non-Jewish employees and workers or give them notice. The action committees, in agreement with the political leaders of the district, must organize mass demonstrations and processions in all areas on Friday evening. On the Saturday morning at 10 o'clock at latest, the posters of the boycott proclamation must be put up on all advertising spaces. At the same time, lorries, or better still furniture vans, must be driven through the streets with posters bearing the following words in the order given: In defense against the Jewish atrocity and boycott campaign. Boycott all Jewish shops. Don't buy from Jewish stores. Don't go to Jewish lawyers. Avoid Jewish doctors. The Jews are our bane. The committees must organize collections in the German shops to finance this movement of defense." End of quote. During the days preceding April 1st, the following announcement was posted on all advertisement spaces throughout Germany. Quote, "The Jews have time to reflect until Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. Then the fight begins. The Jews of the whole world are trying to destroy Germany. German people, defend yourselves. Don't buy from the Jews." End of quote. Several of the government departments also issued instructions as to the measures which were to be taken in connection with the boycott. All sections of the Nazi organization also issued detailed instructions. There was no party official who failed to take the opportunity to make himself important by issuing an instruction of some kind. Treatment of judges. An eyewitness has given us the following report. Quote, "On Friday, March 31st, an extraordinary scene took place in front of the High Court in Cologne. Nazi lads forced their way into the court buildings and dragged out the Jewish lawyers and judges. Then these were put into a refuse cart and made the laughingstock of the crowd. Many of the lawyers and judges were still wearing their robes. The police looked on without interfering. The cart was then taken to the main police station, which is a considerable distance from the court. The official report, which is an absolute lie, was as follows. In Cologne, members of the Nazi storm troop, in conjunction with the police, arrested a number of Jewish judges and lawyers for their personal safety, as a large crowd had collected in front of the law courts." End of quote. The boycott had a limit, namely at the point when it endangered profit. In effect, all these measures only hurt the Jewish middle class and working class, but not the big Jewish capitalists. And when it was a question of trade with foreigners, all prejudice and race hatred had to fall into the background, and the Jews were not treated as sub-men or world pests, but only as extremely welcome paying guests. Here is a report published in the Frankfurter Zeitung. Quote, "Wiesbaden, May 31st. Up to the present this year, the number of visitors has fallen below expectations. The number of foreign visitors during the first week of May, which is always the height of the season for Wiesbaden, was 1,744, and in the festival week following it rose only to 1,808, falling again to 1,760 in the third week. The total number of visitors up to the middle of May has only been 27,000. It is therefore in the interests of this health resort that the local magistrates, the directors of the courthouse, and the national district leaders should make it known to everyone concerned, both in the country and abroad, that the mineral springs of Wiesbaden are as before available without hindrance to all visitors from all countries, and that peace and order have never been disturbed in this town. The authorities of Wiesbaden should feel their responsibility both to the population and also to foreign visitors, and should guarantee to all who are either permanently in Wiesbaden or make a temporary stay there, without regard to their religion or political outlook, a secure and pleasant visit." End of quote. End of Chapter 8, Part 2. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Chapter 8 of Brown Book of the Hitler Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Brown Book of the Hitler Terror by Lord Marley. Chapter 8, Part 3. Laws of Exception. The open boycott ended on April 1st, although the National Socialist press, the official leaders of the party, as well as their spokesman, had assured the whole organization that this historic Saturday must be regarded as merely a test preparatory to a whole series of other measures, which would be carried out unless the opinion of the world, which at the moment was hostile, underwent a complete change. Opinion in other countries certainly changed radically, but in a direction unfavorable to the Third Empire. The government in Germany was quick to notice this. In fact, they noted it even before the boycott, and they realized that this open demonstration against the Jews was bad business. The National Socialists have principles, but they have always been prepared to sell them. The retreat. In the course of the week before the boycott, even Herr Streicher, evidently under instructions from the government, stated that it would not be necessary to resume the boycott, and the Minister for Propaganda and National Enlightenment told the representatives of the foreign press on March 31st, quote, that the government had decided provisionally to restrict the boycott against the Jews to Saturday, April 1st, when it would operate from 10 o'clock in the morning till 8 in the evening. After that, no further action would be taken until Wednesday. If the international press had by then stopped its agitation against Germany, no further action would be taken. But if this were not the case, a boycott would be started at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning, and this boycott would drive the Jews of Germany into absolute ruin. The instructions that 2 months' wages and salaries of employees of Jewish firms must be paid in advance from April 1st is cancelled. End of quote. The last sentence of this announcement shows that under the pressure of events the National Socialists had been forced to repeal their own decrees. It had originally been decided that all owners of Jewish shops must pay all their Christian employees 2 months' salary in advance. The consequence of this was a run on the banks which might have led to a catastrophe if this decree had not been withdrawn at the earliest possible moment. The silent boycott. The public boycott was a demonstration, and as a demonstration it failed and was not resumed. On the other hand, the silent boycott was continued, a boycott which cost nothing and hit not so much the rich and powerful Jewish firms as the tens of thousands of Jewish employees, doctors, lawyers, teachers, officials, university professors, etc. Hundreds of thousands of Jews have been deprived of their living, but this has given hundreds of thousands of places for Nazi hangers-on. Jewish lawyers not allowed to practice. In Berlin, at first out of 1,200 Jewish lawyers, only 35 were permitted to practice, and the number allowed to continue their practice in Cologne was only 4. All Jewish judges have been given leave of absence. The commissioner of the Prussian Ministry of Justice issued the following instructions on March 31st. Quote, "The irritation of the people at the presumptuous attitude of Jewish lawyers and doctors has reached such a height that it is necessary to take into account the possibility that the people may take the law into their own hands, especially during the period of the defense campaign of the German people against the Jewish atrocity propaganda. This would endanger the authority of the administration of justice. I therefore request you to suggest to all Jewish judges now in office that they should at once apply for leave of absence, and this should immediately be granted to them. Please arrange with the Lawyers Association or other local organizations of the legal profession that from 10 o'clock tomorrow morning the number of Jewish lawyers permitted to practice is fixed in a proportion which is the same as that of the Jewish population to the rest of the population. It is unnecessary to point out that Jewish lawyers should not be employed as junior counsel, nor should they be allowed to take doc briefs or be appointed receivers in bankruptcy or trustees. All engagements of Jewish lawyers in connection with official cases must immediately be withdrawn. The executives of associations of lawyers must be induced to resign. If the provincial and local leaders of the National Socialists express the desire to supervise the maintenance of security and order within the court building by sending armed pickets to these places, their wishes should be complied with." End of quote. Similar instructions were issued against Jewish doctors. In the first place, they were excluded from health insurance practice, which, of course, covered the great majority of all cases. The teachers and lecturers in Prussian educational institutions were required by the Minister of Culture, Rust, to fill out a questionnaire as to their racial origin. The civil service. As for government officials, the following decree was published in the beginning of April. Quote, "Anyone of non-Aryan descent, particularly if their parents or grandparents were Jewish, is to be regarded as non-Aryan. One parent or one grandparent who is non-Aryan is sufficient. This is particularly to be assumed when one parent or grandparent has been a member of the Jewish religious community. Furthermore, every official who has joined the service since August 1st, 1914, must prove that he is of Aryan descent, or that he fought at the front, or that his son or father fell in the World War. Birth certificates and marriage certificates of parents, in addition to military papers, must be sent in. If the Aryan descent of an official is doubtful, a decision must be made by the Office of Experts for Racial Investigation attached to the Ministry of the Interior. In deciding whether the provisions of Section 4, Paragraph 1 apply, the whole political activity of the official concerned, particularly since November 9th, 1918, must be taken into account. Every official is under an obligation to inform his superior authorities to what political party he has hitherto belonged and what his political activities have been. The Reichsbanner, the Republican Richterbund, and the League for the Rights of Man are to be considered political parties within the meaning of this paragraph. This decree finally and definitely puts an end to the scandal of the November system, which aims at the destruction of the honest professional government servant by the introduction of party officials and office seekers. The consequences of this criminal policy have been the innumerable scandals of corruption, in which the people concerned were always representatives of the parties which, in November 1918, by treason and cowardice had put themselves at the head of a clean and untarnished state. It is well known, and does not require to be proved here in detail, that the most prominent supporters of the November Republic had been involved in the worst of these affairs. That period is now gone forever, and the new Germany will once more be administered by really efficient officials, as the world knows it was before the war." End of quote. The special importance of this decree is that subsequently almost all categories of university-trained people, doctors, lawyers, teachers in high schools, etc., and also bank officials and commercial employees were put through a sieve in accordance with the principles laid down in this decree. The attack on Jewish doctors. The following manifesto was published in the Medical Journal of Greater Berlin, dated May 20th, 1933. The writer, a certain Dr. Rupin, is not just a nobody. He is commissioner of the Provincial Medical Association of the provinces of Brandenburg and Grenzmark. The article is headed, "Away with Jewish Doctors." The text is as follows. Quote, "The complete removal of Jews from all academic professions is necessary. Members of the free academic professions, particularly doctors, come into personal contact with very wide circles of the population, and occupy a position of confidence in relation to their patients, which gives them influence over the outlook of the people with whom they are in contact. The provincial executive of the doctors of Brandenburg therefore considers it unthinkable that in our national state a Jew should have the possibility of spreading the poison of Jewish thought in this way. Undoubtedly, the earlier ideal conception of professional duty has given way in wide circles of the profession to the Jewish commercial outlook, and this is due to the overloading of the profession with Jews. This commercial attitude must be driven out of the medical profession, and we must make its reintroduction impossible. Insofar as corruption has penetrated the profession, it must be rooted out by the most decisive measures. We, German doctors, therefore demand the exclusion of all Jews from the possibility of giving medical treatment to our German people, because the Jew is the incarnation of lies and deceit. Furthermore, we demand legislation to punish with imprisonment and immediate removal from the profession the offenses and crimes which are associated with the positions of confidence filled by the profession. We doctors ask all national professional organizations in Germany to support our demand." End of quote. By way of supplement to the above, we give the following decree of Commissioner Dr. Wagner, who is in control of the German medical associations. Quote, "In pursuance of the boycott against the Jews, the Berlin Health Department, by agreement with the mayor, instructed its sections not to meet any claims from its members where Jewish doctors have been called in to treat cases on or after April 1st. Where a Jewish doctor had previously been called in, it is suggested that members should consider whether to continue to make use of him. The Health Insurance Institute hopes that a sense of national duty will prevent the members from making use of Jewish chemists, dispensaries, opticians, or dentists." End of quote. Dismissal of Jewish teachers. We can give only a few examples of the many similar instructions which have been issued in connection with the various professions. The future position of Jewish teachers in Germany is indicated by a letter issued by one of the most prominent of the Nazi leaders, Dr. Loppelmann, a member of the Prussian Diet. Quote, "We call your attention to the fact that it is intolerable that Jewish teachers should still fill posts in Prussian educational institutions, while German soldiers who fought at the front have to wander around as unpaid auxiliary teachers in their own fatherland. Furthermore, we consider it an impossible situation that any regard should be paid to the exaggerated claims of male and female Jewish scholars. On behalf of the National Socialist Parliamentary Fraction in Prussia, we expect you to take the following measures. 1. All Jewish teachers, that is, teachers of Jewish descent, must immediately be dismissed or sent on leave from all Prussian educational institutions. 2. In the case of male and female scholars who are Jews, the proportionate clause must be applied so that the percentage of pupils of Jewish origin in any institution must correspond with the proportion of Jews to the whole German population, that is to say, only 1% of the students at any institution may be Jews or of Jewish descent." End of quote. In accordance with this circular, almost all Jewish teachers employed in the public educational system were immediately granted leave. An instruction issued by the chief official of Brandenburg and Berlin extended these measures also to Jewish private teachers. A cabinet meeting on April 25th passed an act, quote, "against the excessive number of students of foreign race in German schools and universities." End of quote. The same principles were applied to the staffs of universities. In an earlier chapter, some of the best-known Jewish lecturers who have been dismissed are mentioned. Removal of Jewish editors and journalists. The Neue Freie Presse of April 13, 1933 reports, quote, "In the extraordinary general meeting of the members of the Berlin District Organization of the National Union of the German Press, it was unanimously decided to nominate Dr. Dietrich at the General Delegate Meeting for the presidency of the Union. After the general meeting of the Berlin organization, the new committee met and adopted unanimously a motion that in future no Jewish or Marxist editors were to be admitted to membership. A further motion for the General Delegate Meeting was also adopted unanimously, demanding that Jewish and Marxist editors not be permitted to enter or belong to the National Union of the German Press." End of quote. Almost all Jewish editors of German papers have been dismissed, and contributions from independent journalists of Jewish faith or Jewish origin are not accepted. It must be noted that in this connection even Jewish newspaper proprietors have achieved inglorious distinction. For example, Gutermann, the Jewish proprietor of the Neue Badische Landeszeitung in Mannheim, dismissed all his Jewish editorial staff and employees as early as March 1st. Debarred from lists of assessors and juries. The silent boycott of the Jews continues in every sphere. They are being banished from all public life. The Neue Freie Presse of April 12th reports the exclusion of Jews from the lists of assessors, jurymen, and arbitrators. Quote, "The government has decided to shorten the current period of office of all assessors and jurymen to June 30th, at which date the period of office of commercial arbitrators will also be brought to a close. The new lists of assessors and jurymen will be differently constituted in the future. As in present circumstances, the municipal authorities will naturally send people of a different outlook to participate in the electoral colleges. There will no longer be any communist assessors and jurymen. The number of Social Democrats nominated will be considerably smaller than hitherto, and it is probable that no Jews will be elected. The appointment of the new commercial arbitrators will also be on the same lines. The decree just issued provides that until new elections of assessors and jurymen are held, judges need not adhere to the existing rules for bringing in lay assistants. For example, they may pass over certain names on the lists." End of quote. Jews as outcasts in sport. Even in sport, every Jew is an outcast. Although even in America colored boxers are allowed to take part in championship fights, German boxers of Jewish faith or origin are no longer allowed to appear in the boxing ring in Germany. The holder of the middleweight championship in Germany, Erich Seelig, was prevented from defending his title in Germany. He was, however, able to show his form in France. Daniel Pren, who is far and away the best tennis player in Germany, can no longer be selected to represent Germany in international matches. We await with interest the steps which are to be taken against Helena Meyer, the champion woman fencer. Although probably no one looks more pure-blooded and Nordic than she does, she is the daughter of a Jewish doctor in Offenbach. We quote the following as a good example of many similar announcements. It was printed in the Neue Freie Presse of April 28, 1933. Quote, "The German Swimming Association issues the following statement. The German Swimming Association has adopted the Aryan Clause. In what form the membership of Jews in all sports associations, and therefore in the Swimming Association, will be regulated, and whether the Aryan Clause will be incorporated in the statutes of the association, will be determined in accordance with instructions issued by the government. Meanwhile, I order that Jews shall be removed from all leading positions in the association and put into the background, and they must not appear as representatives in displays or take part in sports meetings." George Hacks. The German Swimming Association is at present affiliated to the International Swimming Association, and the Aryan Clause conflicts with the statutes of the latter body, which prescribe equality of rights for everyone. The president of the International Swimming Association is, however, Binner, who was removed from the executive of the German Association because of his international outlook. Pending the final decision of the Government Commissioner of Sport, the regulations relating to official posts will be applied to Jewish members of the DSB Union. This means that only those Jews, by race, not religion, who enjoy protection under the civil service law will be allowed to take part in sports meetings. End of quote. Malicious rumors. But when business questions come in this connection also loyalty to principle takes second place. The government-controlled 12 Uhr Mittagsblatt of April 19, 1933, under the heading Malicious Rumors, gives an assurance that the race question will not be raised at the 11th Olympiad, which is to take place in Berlin in 1936. Quote, "The foreign boycott propaganda against Germany has even penetrated sport. Many foreign papers have repeatedly stated during the last few weeks that efforts are being made, especially in the United States, to transfer to another country the Olympic Games which have been arranged for Berlin in 1936, on the alleged grounds that measures will be taken in Germany to prevent Jewish sportsmen from taking part in international competitions. In reply to an official inquiry, Avery Brundage, chairman of the American Olympic Committee, stated that the International Olympic Committee had the right to select where the Olympiad would be held. The committee, which is to meet in Vienna in June, would undoubtedly consider the question. His personal opinion was that the Olympic Games should not be held in a country where the fundamental Olympic principle of the equality of all races was being violated. In connection with the premature declaration made by this leading American sportsman, it must be stated that no measures have been or will be taken in Germany which make participation in international sporting events dependent on the question of race. The world can be confident that every individual who is sent to Berlin to represent his country in the Olympic Games will be received and treated as a guest, irrespective of his race or nationality." End of quote. Passports. Special regulations are also enforced for Jewish holders of passports. The Breslau chief of police has issued instructions, quote, "that German citizens of Jewish faith, or formerly of Jewish faith, who are in possession of passports must present these in person at the police headquarters of the area in which they live, not later than April 3, 1933. The passports will be returned after they have been altered so as to make them valid only for internal traveling in Germany." End of quote. Special hours for the baths. There is hardly any possible regulation calculated to bring Jewish citizens into disrepute of which some person in authority or some administrative body has not thought. The town of Speyer in the Palatinate will live in the history of these times for its unique inventive powers. It has the glory of being the first German municipal authority to issue a regulation, quote, "that in the interests of public order, Jews may only use the municipal baths at certain hours of the day." End of quote. Other German municipal authorities were quick to follow this example. The Frankfurter Zeitung of May 24, 1933 reports, quote, "at the Tübingen council meeting on May 15th, it was moved by a National Socialist that Jews and persons of foreign race be excluded from the use of the free municipal baths. The motion was adopted with only 3 voting against it." End of quote. Shortly afterwards, the Upper Silesian newspapers published similar regulations. Dismissal of Jewish employees. It would be a mistake to think that German Jews were only thrown out of the professions. A good deal is said, and rightly so, about the outlawry of Jewish professors, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and artists, but unfortunately not so much attention is paid to the treatment of Jewish employees, small traders, and workers. But the main part of the Jewish population is covered by these categories, and the economic position of these Jews is just as difficult as that of the non-Jewish lower middle class and working class. The Nazi factory cell organizations have been most assiduous in depriving the Jewish clerks, small traders, and workers of their livelihood. A Berlin message of March 31st runs, quote, "On the instructions of the National Socialist Party Executive, the Factory Cell Organization instructs National Socialist Factory Cell Committees, together with the workers' organizations, to visit the Jewish shops and demand 2 months' payment in advance for Christian workers and employees. The demand should also be made that all Jewish employees be dismissed. Anyone refusing to comply with these demands must be immediately reported to the party leadership, which will take the necessary steps. Punctually at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, all employees and workers in Jewish shops must leave work and take part in warning off customers. Newspapers and vital industries are excepted, but in any case all Jewish employees must be dismissed. In the Ulstein publishing house the whole of the responsible editorial staff of Jewish race has been granted leave of absence." End of quote. The Frankfurter Zeitung of May 28, 1933 states, quote, "It is reported in the Postnecker Handlerblatt, the official journal of the Association of German Merchants, Showmen, and Commercial Travelers, whose headquarters are at Dresden, that at a provincial conference of the Union of Traders, the question was raised whether Jewish merchants and traders would be allowed access to the markets in future. The president of the provincial organization put forth the view that the Jews must be completely rooted out." End of quote. Business is business, even for anti-Semites. The Völkischer Beobachter of April 2nd proclaims the spontaneous rise of prices on the stock exchange, now rid of Jews, as the most obvious result of the boycott movement. We know why such a point is made of this. It is to show that the fight is not against the existing system, not against capitalism, and not even against the excesses of capitalism, but that it is a competitive fight of the national profiteers against the Jewish profiteers. The members of the stock exchange can do business even on a stock exchange now rid of Jews. The fight is not against capitalism, not against private property, but against the small man, against the Aryan workers and middle class who are being hoaxed, against the Jewish employees and small traders who are being ruined, to the delight of the capitalists of Aryan and Jewish blood. The Aryan principles are regulated everywhere by the size of a man's purse. In a statement printed in the Berliner Tageblatt of March 31, 1933, Herr Oskar Wassermann, a director of the Deutsche Bank und Diskonto-Gesellschaft, correctly stated that he had not suffered the least inconvenience, and that the change of things had not made any noticeable difference so far as he was concerned, even from a social standpoint. The other Jewish capitalists may equally congratulate themselves. The National Socialist government is doing its utmost for their material well-being. It has issued reproofs to those in its lower organizations who thought that the basis of anti-Semitism was the National Socialist hostility to capitalism. It protects, if not the Jews, at least Jewish capital, business first. Capitalism, whether Aryan or represented by Jews, is not to fall a victim to the spiritual revival which the national revolution has brought to boiling point. The Frankfurter Zeitung and the Völkischer Beobachter of March 27th published the following letter addressed by the Commissioner for Trade, Dr. Wagner, to the President of the National Socialist Party Office for Municipal Politics, Mayor Fehler of Munich. Quote, I have recently received from a number of business firms copies of circulars issued by various local authorities to a large number of manufacturers and other business concerns, with a view to ascertaining whether the concerns can be regarded as German undertakings. The questions put in the circulars are intended to discover to what extent the capital of the firm concerned is German, to what extent non-Aryan and non-German principles are connected with it, and so forth. While I am of course completely in agreement with the view that the municipalities particularly should only obtain their requirements from German firms, I nevertheless consider it necessary that a stop should be put to the measures which have been taken. The whole complex of questions raised in these circulars is not so simple that decisions can be made by a mere yes or no or on the basis of figures. It is rather the government's task to see that every undertaking in Germany, no matter where its capital comes from or who controls it, finds its place in the German economic system, and that the management of each undertaking is in future conducted exclusively from a German economic standpoint. In carrying through this necessary task, the government can, however, only be hindered if, through the action of certain authorities, a situation is created which reacts unfavorably on economic life. Our aim cannot be to ruin existing economic undertakings in Germany, even if they are worked with foreign capital and have hitherto been directed to some extent by foreign individuals, but rather to compel them to act in a German way and in conformity with the great principle laid down by our leader, the common good before private interests. I must therefore request you to use your influence as the leader of the Department of Municipal Politics to prevent further circulars of this type being issued in future, and to explain that such measures will cause a dislocation in the whole of the country's economic life which, with the best will in the world, we do not want at the present time." End of quote. With the best will in the world. They do not want any capitalist to suffer loss in this national revolution. We knew this long ago. The people who still swear by the socialist Adolf Hitler and expect him to perform the miracle of securing for the peasants higher prices and at the same time lower prices for the consumer, higher wages for the workers, and at the same time greater profits for the employers, higher salaries for civil servants together with economies to the state. These misled and incited miracle believers will before long be roused from their hypnotized state by the undeniable and inexorable fact that in the Third Empire no one gains anything but the capitalists, whether they are of Jewish or non-Jewish faith. They will learn, from what they still have to experience in the Third Empire, that the whole campaign against the Jews has only served to distract them from the struggle against the people who are really responsible for their conditions. The Aryan Clause and Race Officials. We have seen that the anti-Semitism of the New Germany has a biological basis, that it is racial anti-Semitism. This biological anti-Semitism dates back to the anti-Semitic campaign led by the court chaplain Stocker, which derived its ideology, that is, its pseudo-scientific justification, from Eugen Dühring's The Jewish Question as a Question of Racial Character. Race science, which used to be a hobby horse of freak writers and was never taken seriously, has now in the new Germany been declared as an official science, which means that it is now a lucrative profession. The Jews as a race. It is true that in spite of all its efforts this science has not yet succeeded in proving that the Germans are a race. On the contrary, it is evident that the Germans are a mixed people and are very far from having any right to call themselves Nordic. But these curious research workers have not yet even succeeded in proving that the Jews are really a race. We will come to their aid. There is something in the talk of a Jewish race. But in this case, too, it is necessary to stand things on their head in order to examine the matter, which is extremely complex. That is to say, we must treat race not as an original factor but as an artificial product, not as the beginning but as the result of a process of evolution. To attempt to trace back the Jews of the present day to the original Jews of the Bible would be a hazardous and absurd undertaking. In the course of Jewish history, there was a constant mingling of races which it is not easy to disentangle. But from about A.D. 1000, at the end of the period of proselytism, that is, the entry of people of other faiths into the Jewish religious community, the religion and laws of the Jews themselves, and the social relations in which they lived maintained an inbreeding which in duration and degree has no parallel in European history. The anthropological characteristics of race originated during this period, which in the course of more than 800 years produced a new type of human being, namely the Jew. But what is to be gained, even by proving the existence of Jewish racial characteristics, is quite another matter. The special characteristics of the Jews against which the anti-Semites pretend they are fighting are not in any way the product of race, but of the social conditions in which they live. The fact that they are a caste whose conditions of existence are prescribed by the world around them. When these imposed conditions no longer exist, then the characteristics disappear immediately, that is to say, at least in the second generation which has not had to live in these conditions. But such theoretical discussions take us a long way from the actual practice of National Socialism. In this sphere everything is much simpler and more straightforward. There is not a single question in which National Socialism has acted in accordance with its own arguments. On the contrary, it has always post factum found venal persons to justify its own barbarities as acts of culture. And if in Germany today racial research sets itself up as science, the real purpose is only to provide a new cloak for the bestialities of the existing regime. Race officials. The Frankfurter Zeitung of May 5, 1933 reports, quote, Dortmund, May 4th, TU. The Government Commissioner of Dortmund has issued instructions for the immediate organization of a race department in Dortmund. The Assistant Commissioner for Health, Dr. Braus, who is to take charge of the department, has made an important statement to the press on the question of racial hygiene. He indicated that medical material relating to the 80,000 schoolchildren in Dortmund, which provided partial material for statistics of race hygiene, was already available. Thus, the department would first deal with the young persons who would constitute the next generation. At the same time, the investigations laid down under the recently published regulations would be undertaken, that is, in connection with the candidates for official positions and the students in the higher schools and universities. Investigation of the whole population would be a task for future years. The early publication of laws for the separation of the race and its division into types was to be anticipated. The essential feature of this legislation would be the prohibition of any intermingling of races in Germany. The population would also have to be divided into families whose offspring would be welcome to the state, and those whose offspring would be regarded as a burden on the nation. The logical consequence would be the demand for the compulsory sterilization of criminals and other antisocial elements. The fact that all the medical associations of Prussia had recently declared in favor of the sterilization of criminals, in the interests of the nation as a whole, proved that this demand put forward by the National Socialists was already recognized as justified by wide circles of the nation. The fundamental aim of the organization of racial hygiene could only be reached after some generations, but a government which was conscious of its responsibility was obliged to think in terms of generations." Dr. Achim Gerke, a pushing young man, got himself appointed ministerial advisor and expert for racial research at the Ministry of the Interior. Men and submen. All of this seems relatively harmless. It is primarily directed to bring about the economic destruction of the Jewish population, but not to threaten life and limb. The following leaflet is not so harmless. It was distributed in thousands in all restaurants, and in particular was given to every German girl who was seen in company with a Jew. This document threatens every girl who is suspected of the terrible crime of being friendly with a Jew, that her face will be branded with the initials JH, Judenhor, Jewish prostitute. The assurance is given that this is no mere empty threat, but that in any circumstances it will be carried out if the girl is seen again in company with a Jew. In this we have a clearer example of the National Socialist distinction between men and submen being everyone who does not think and feel as the National Socialists do. The National Socialists divide the men and the submen into different groups. In Group 1 are the pure representatives of the Nordic race. In Group 2, according to Ziel und Weg, the journal of the National Socialist doctors, are, along with, quote, inebriates, drug takers, habitual criminals, and prostitutes, all persons of foreign race, particularly Jews. End of quote. The National Socialist race theoretician, Professor Stammler, proposed on behalf of the National Socialist doctors the following law for the division of the race. Quote, 1. Every person who is of foreign racial blood to the extent of 1/2, that is, one of whose parents or two of whose grandparents were of foreign race, irrespective of their religion, is regarded as of foreign race. Foreign race means all colored races, near Asiatic and Oriental races, including the Jew. 2. In conformity with this, every adult German citizen must declare on oath at the registration office for his area to what race he belongs. In the case of persons under age, the declaration must be made by their legal representatives. False declarations will be punished with imprisonment and confiscation of property. 3. Persons ascertained to be of foreign race must in future describe themselves not as Germans, but as of foreign race, Jews from Germany, etc. 4. Persons born after the Day of Grace are to rank as Germans only when both parents are German. Younger brothers or sisters, however, rank as of the same nationality as their elder brothers or sisters whose nationality has been established by declaration. End of quote. Breeding farms. Professor Stammler, whose name has already been mentioned, writes that, quote, the aim of breeding is a physically, morally, and mentally sound person of Nordic race. End of quote. To help towards the achievement of this aim, breeding farms are to be provided. The outpourings of a certain Professor Ernst Bergmann indicate what kind of breeding farms they have in mind. Quote, there are quite enough willing and industrious men and youths to provide mates for the available women and girls, and fortunately, one lively lad suffices for 10 to 20 girls who have not yet killed their desire for a child, were it not for the civilized nonsense, so contrary to nature, of monogamous and permanent marriage. End of quote. Professor Ernst Bergmann in Erkenntnisgeist und Muttergeist. We conclude these examples with yet another Bill for the Preservation of Race Purity, which contains the following. Quote, 1. Marriages between Germans and persons of foreign races are prohibited. Those which have already been contracted remain valid, but new marriages must not be entered into and will not be recognized. 2. Extramatrimonial sexual intercourse between Germans and persons of foreign race will be punished with penal servitude for the person of foreign race and imprisonment for the German party. Prostitutes do not come under this law. 3. The entry into Germany of persons of foreign race is only allowed in special circumstances. The settlement in Germany of persons of foreign race is prohibited. 4. Changes of name, which in most cases are for the sole purpose of concealing the race of the person concerned, are prohibited until further notice. Changes of name made since 1914 are cancelled. End of quote. It may be objected that this kind of nonsense has no real connection with the mass movement, that these race hygienists are only on the edge of the movement, which cannot be regarded as responsible for them. This suggestion is not well founded. A man like Professor Stammler is the official adviser on these questions. The bills drafted by him were introduced by the National Socialist fraction in the Reichstag. They are therefore typical and must be taken seriously as agitation material. Liquidation of the Jewish question. We have given a small number of examples out of the massive incidents in the war of extermination which is being waged against 600,000 German Jews. These documents and facts are typical of the artificially nurtured hatred of the Jews, who have once more in Europe's history been given the role of scapegoats. We have tried to show that in general this fanaticism is not directed against those who were first made the object of hatred, the big bankers, merchants, and speculators. The wrath of the people has once more been turned aside against the lesser fry, against the Jewish middle class and the Jewish working class. Forced denials. What action did the Jews in Germany take? They protested against the foreign atrocity propaganda. Under the pressure of the stormtroopers, they sent out into the world documents which were the product of mortal fear. Often their fear has made them go further than is necessary. No one can blame them. Not every man is a born hero. And eventually an enterprising man got the idea of publishing these denials which had been forced from the Jews in book form under the title The Atrocity Propaganda. The government-controlled Berliner Tageblatt devotes 2 columns to this extremely welcome book, but no one in the world will let himself be led to believe that it was not written by men in fear of their lives and their liberty, and that they were not compelled against their better knowledge to spread the lie that there is no persecution of Jews in Germany. Jews who support Hitler. There are even Jews who support Hitler. In the Jewish press, Wien, Bratislava of March 31st, the organ of the Orthodox Jews, a rabbi, Professor Dr. Weinberg, writes as follows, quote, "In Jewish circles generally, and particularly in Orthodox circles, there is more sympathy and understanding for the national revival in Germany than the leaders of this movement realize. The religious Jews know how particularly grateful they must be to Hitler for his energetic and thoroughgoing fight against communism." End of quote. The central organ of German Zionists, the Jüdische Rundschau, adopts the same attitude. Quote, "Jewish history will understand even Hitler. It will cite him as evidence of the fact that history is made up of the imponderables of human endeavor towards an ideal, no matter what this may be." End of quote. We have already quoted the statement made by the third partner in the alliance with Jewish orthodoxy and Jewish nationalism, Jewish capitalism, the statement made by Oskar Wassermann, director of the Deutsche Bank und Diskonto-Gesellschaft, that he has not suffered the least inconvenience and that he has hardly been able to notice the change in things. Lenin on anti-Semitism. We have not hushed up these statements. On the contrary, they seem to us convincing proof that in the last analysis the Jewish question too is not a question of race but a class question. The similar experience in Russia under the Tsardom is summarized by Lenin as follows. Quote, "The propagation of hostility against the Jews is described as anti-Semitism. When the accursed Tsarist monarchy was at its last gasp, it tried to incite the ignorant workers and peasants against the Jews. The Tsar's police, in league with the landlords and the capitalists, organized pogroms. They tried to deflect the hatred of the workers and peasants, crushed down by want, from the landlords and exploiters and turn it against the Jews. It has often been the same in other countries too. The capitalists have roused up hostility against the Jews in order to throw dust in the eyes of the workers and distract them from the real enemy of the toiling peoples, capital. It is not the Jews who are the enemy of the toiling people. The enemies of the workers are the capitalists of every country. There are workers, toilers among the Jews. These form the majority. They are our brothers, our comrades in the fight for socialism, because they are oppressed by capital. There are kulaks, exploiters, capitalists among the Jews as among all other peoples. The capitalists strive to arouse hostility between the workers of different religious beliefs, of different nations and races. The rich Jews, like the rich Russians and the rich people of all countries, all in league with each other, trample on, oppress, and contaminate the workers. Shame and contempt upon the accursed Tsarism which tortured and persecuted the Jews. Shame and contempt upon those who sow hostility against the Jews and hatred against other nations." End of quote. End of chapter 8. Recorded by Colleen McMahon.